This is TWiT.
This one's pretty interesting. In the past, local governments would work with wireless carriers to make deals on what it would cost for carriers to actually deploy and maintain wireless installations in their areas. Now, this meant that there was no standardized costs for the carriers, and local governments could make sure that the deal also included costs to maintain the network as well. Now, while this past couple months, the FCC's been working on a new plan in hopes it will stimulate new deployments, especially in areas that haven't had a chance to have wireless yet. Now, the plan is to standardize the fees to the deployments of new wireless. Now, FCC's reasoning is to encourage the installation of small cell units for 5G adoption. The interesting part here is even though they hope it will stimulate coverage increase, it doesn't actually call out any requirements for carriers to build in areas where they don't have infrastructure or wireless as well today. Now, the FCC plan proposes upfront application fees of only $100 for each small cell deployment, and usually the size of the suitcase is the size of that 5G deployment, and add annual feta fees of up to $270 per small tower. Now, this is interesting because it does limit the local governments that how much they may charge for placing 5G deployments, even on cells, on small poles or traffic lights or any other place. Heather, I want to start with you because I think this is quite relevant to your area. Will this spark the increase of network installation, especially in areas that don't have it yet?
Well, given that there's no requirement that the cell carriers actually do anything that they weren't going to do already, all we've done is rewarded them for doing what they wanted to do, and now they're just saying you don't have to pay. So the local community isn't gathering isn't getting reimbursed for the fair use of their property, and there's nothing that says this is going to spark anything.
Right. Well, Curtis, which way will this go? I mean, will carriers just take the extra capital and reinvest it somewhere else, or will they maybe like marketing or something, or do you think they'll actually take it and start moving it to new infrastructure?
Oh, I think the likelihood is great that the carriers will take the extra funds and return them as profits to their shareholders. That's kind of what they've done with most of the tax benefits that we've seen given to companies this year. So I have no reason to believe they'll do anything else with this money that they don't have to spend. There are a lot of issues with this proposal. And among them is the fact that it values real estate the same regardless of where in the nation it is. It's saying that real estate on a pole in Manhattan is worth exactly what real estate is worth on a pole in a town of 5,000 in Idaho. And I think that's a fairly ridiculous proposal. But it is entirely in keeping with the business and government philosophy of the current administration. So I don't know why anyone would be surprised by the proposal.
Right. Now, Heather, do you think this will actually cut the hands off of the local governments to make sure that their needs are met? Because I think a lot of them are saying, hey, the costs of these deployments are not just the installations, it's also to maintain them. It's also to make sure if things happen to them later on, if they're just kind of sore-eye things, we need to cover them up, that kind of thing. So we need to have kind of continual cost or COGS to basically maintain them. Is this just another way to prevent them from having to gouge the carriers for that?
Yeah, and first of all, I don't really think that there's a gouge going on for the price that has been negotiated. But I'd also like to add that I don't think you needed me today for the snark. I think Curt brought it. I'm over here applauding it. What he said. But no, I think that the other thing is that we got to think about when it comes to these rural communities, there's not a lot of revenue generation, and they're taking this. This is an excellent source of revenue that you, like you said, there's upkeep and there's maintenance. On the other hand, I'd say there's not going to be a lot of upkeep or maintenance to be done because I don't think the rural areas are going to be seeing a lot of investment from these carriers. So there's not going to be a whole lot to keep up. I think that Curt's exactly right. They're going to take this money and put it into something that's going to benefit them better. I would have loved to have seen some kind of a codicil or something in the paperwork that would have said, in exchange for this, you need to do your due diligence and actually be a service provider. And that means for including the 39% of rural America that doesn't have service.
Absolutely. So I think that brings up an interesting topic, because I think there was a call out here from Blair Levin, who used to be the previous FCC chair back in '93. He acknowledged that he said that, hey, carriers actually have acknowledged this themselves, that they didn't really have issues. Like, they made good deals with local governments. They made deals that would work. And it wasn't really any obstacles to creating deployment. So, Curt, I guess I want to throw it to you and just get your point of view here. What do you think the motivation behind this is then? If they're saying, if the carriers at one point have, obviously said, hey, this we're doing fine, we're working it out, and the local governments are happy because they basically strike a deal that works for them as well, then why put these restrictions on it? I mean, obviously they say, hey, it's going to save the industry $2 billion. Let's hope that gets put back into infrastructure, but that can't be the only reason, right?
Why no? I think if you want to look at motivation, all you have to do is look at the lobbying budget of the major wireless carriers, see just how many lobbyists they keep busy in Washington, D.C., and somewhere in the intersection of number of lobbyists and number of dollars, you'll find the motivation. I will say that I find it fascinating that part of the governing principle that the current administration espouses is federalism, where you basically try to get the control of government action as close to the voter as possible, except when doing so might cost a major company extra dollars. In that case, it's vital for the federal government to step in and reduce that impact to the corporation as much as possible. Now, you can tell my philosophy is different. I think that this is one of those cases where it really does make a great deal of sense to have control of things like the pricing for government property, for publicly owned property, fairly close to the public entity that owns that property. So I don't know that this is something that the government has cried for in a great deal. If the carriers have been crying for it, they haven't been doing it very publicly. And so this really is a gift to the carriers and, more importantly, their shareholders, at the expense of local governments, many of whom are trying to find the resources to provide services to their citizens every place possible. If they can't get it from the carriers here, my suspicion is that we will see more things like, speeding tickets. Right.
All right, Heather, I want to throw it back to you for kind of almost the last thought here, because we have to move on. But I think the question to you is, you kind of brought it up. Hey, maybe put in some stipulations in this new rule, these new set of rules, to kind of maybe say, hey, you also have to put some money into infrastructure in areas that don't have it. Let's be a little creative here. What do you think some of the other ways would be to get some of these carriers to kind of move into these areas, these rural areas, and these areas that don't have coverage?
Wow, you need somebody smarter than me to come up with a creative way to do it. But let's go back to the model that we have with the news broadcast. We gave airwaves to TV stations, and in exchange for being able to print their own money 23 hours out of the day, 1 hour out of the day, they were supposed to do a service to the public and produce broadcast news. We all know that went the way of commercialism. But there's got to be a trade-off with, in exchange for operating and saying, I'm buying a spectrum, so I own this, for instance, in the case of a cellular provider, you get to own it for this area. Well, then doggone it, use it. If you own these airwaves, then make sure that it's occupied with your signal and that it's usable by people, or give it back.
Right, absolutely. Now, one last thing, I want to throw back over to Curt, because I think Emily Estrange brings up an interesting point, and she wants to see what you have to say about it. Now, she said, Curtis, what do you think of the EFF? Why is it okay for them to actually have access to lobbying the government just because they do some things that we support?
Oh, and I just was typing to Emily Lestrange. I'm not saying that the carriers shouldn't have lobbyists. I'm just saying that if you're looking for an explanation of why this particular proposal was put forth, that's where I would look. It's not one that makes sense from the federal government perspective because it doesn't really provide any benefit to the federal government or to the nation as a whole unless you define benefit to shareholders as benefiting the nation as a whole. It's one of those things where I just have trouble for this particular thing finding a rationale that I don't get cynical about. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be lobbyists. I think that any individual, any organization has the constitutional right to petition government, whether it be lawmakers or the executive branch. That's in the Constitution. I'm all for it. But while anyone has the right to petition government, government doesn't have the obligation to always say yes. And so I think that this is a case where there could have been more nuanced ways of looking at this. And it's a shame that nuance is something that seems to be lacking at the FCC these days.